Hey, everybody. Welcome to our podcast
Welcome.
episode.
Number 11.
Very good. Very good. Episode 11. Morgan was our lead preacher this week, so he is going to walk us through. We're right at the end of the book of Judges, and as we proclaimed early on, the stories just get wilder as we go. So this is Morgan Smith. I'm Steve Keller, and we get to share in all things pastoral here at the church. As Morgan pointed out before the podcast, we were thinking about playing an April Fool's podcast joke, but we realized it will release tomorrow, so we decided to back off.
Might not have hit as well.
I know.
Yeah.
Hey, you want to walk us through the sermon?
Yeah, so we are, as Steve said, in week 6 of 7 in our sermon series, looking at the major judges in the book of Judges. And this week we had Jephthah.
Yes, we did.
And we kind of see in chapter 10 the idolatry of the people. We've talked about a spiral that's at play, a downward spiral. The idolatry continued. And we kind of see this sevenfold idolatry of the people just kind of turning to each and every nation's God around them, kind of turning to everyone except the Lord their God.
Exactly.
And we see that the people are in this place of desperation once again. They need a leader. And we are introduced to Jephthah, who was a Gileadite, a mighty warrior, and was kicked out of his family. Father Gilead, he was the product of relations between his father and a prostitute. The rest of Gilead's sons, with his wife, kicked Jephthah out, kind of likely created some identity questions for him, some wounds as he was kicked out of his family. But then sometime later, the elders of Gilead come to him and they say, hey, be our warrior, be our leader. He progresses in battle, and as he's moving, it says the Spirit of the Lord comes upon him, progressing in battle, and he makes this vow. And this vow is that if you come through for me, God, in battle, and we overcome the Ammonites, the enemy, then I will sacrifice as a burnt offering the first thing that comes out of my house when I walk home, when I get home. Maybe he thought it was livestock that was going to greet him. It was, in fact, his daughter. And, we get this scene at the end, this tragic scene where he says to her, you've brought me down. And then his daughter says, do to me as you've promised to the Lord. She says, grant me this one request, that I may go into the hills and mourn. He grants her that, and then says that she comes back, and he does to her as he had promised. And the kind of takeaways that we looked at were perpetuated wounds, and then the shrapnel of legalism. Perpetuated wounds that Jephthah was wounded, and ultimately he wounds his daughter. That wounds, if they're not dealt with, are perpetuated, are passed along, if you will, from us to others. And then we see that Jephthah goes beyond the command of God. God didn't tell Jephthah to make this vow. This was a foolish vow. This was because he was insecure. He didn't have faith in God coming through for him in battle, and out of this place of fear and security, he makes this foolish vow. And we looked at the shrapnel of legalism, that Jephthah going beyond the command of God. Legalism goes beyond the command of God. We see that in the Pharisees. But legalism has shrapnel attached to it. It hits other people. And kind of where we ended was who's getting hit by your shrapnel, my shrapnel, our shrapnel, when we go beyond the command of God. So those are some of the things we talked about.
Such a good sermon. There was so much in there. You covered so many chapters. And sometimes in writing a sermon, the trick is, what do you have to leave out? And you did a great job of just bringing us what mattered most, along with some real fun rabbit trails. Like, I love, the little entrance, the password, seeing how they pronounced.
Right, chapter 12.
Just and perfect, yeah.
Speaking of leaving things out, maybe that could have been left out, but
fun.
Didn't necessarily lead to the point that I was making at the end, but it was so much fun.
Yeah, so much. And such an applicable sermon, too. I love that. It's one of the tricks I shouldn't say a trick, but a key of the Christian life is it's so tempting to look at people like the judges or the Pharisees, some of the notorious sinners and saints in the Bible, and just go, how could they, instead of saying, how is this me?
Right.
How do I fall into this? Maybe it's not an idol like they had, but boy, there are a lot of things I give my heart to. So just a good job of that.
Well, and it's so easy to say, how could the Pharisees be the way the Pharisees are, right? Or in the book of Judges, like, are you kidding me?
Yeah.
Like, they just keep getting worse and worse. Like, but then do we, right? Like, do we look at that with, oh, how am I?
Right.
How have I been wounded?
Yeah.
Okay, Jephthah was wounded. And we see the rawness of that wound when the elders come to him and they say, hey, be our leader. And he's like, whoa, didn't you hate me?
Yeah, he puts it back in their face. Yeah, absolutely.
And they're like, nevertheless, be our leader now. Like, they just disregard it. But I think we see the rawness of that wound of, he was like, you kicked me out. You hated me.
Right.
And now you're going to come to me when you need me? Like, what's this about?
Yeah, absolutely.
But in our own lives, how have we been wounded?
Mm-hmm.
And it's easy to look at Jephthah and say, all right, he's been wounded and he's perpetuating that wound later on his daughter.
Yeah.
But how have I been wounded? And as a result of my undealt with wounds, how am I wounding people? That's a more personal.
Yeah.
That hits a little bit deeper. But I think that we gotta not just demonize the Pharisees or these other, the judges, but all right, how, and that was one of the questions I ask is, where is there Pharisee in us?
Right.
Where is there a Pharisee in me? Where on the other question of where do we go beyond the command of God, how do I do that?
Yeah. Yeah, because that is always how it works. We joke around about this sometimes in sermon prep, but nobody wakes up and just says, I'm going to destroy. I'm going to, just make people's lives miserable, wreck my own life. It is always some kind of progression. So one of the things that was really funny about this sermon is that when we were talking in prep, we still have about as many questions as we do answers. There's so much in this story that you just you read it, you look up and you go, I have no idea what's going on here. One of our listeners asked a great question, and this was something we talked about, but the question was, do we see the sins of the father visited upon the son in Jephthah, going through the family? And we were talking about this as well, and it's not just Jephthah's father to Jephthah, but you see it all the way through the story. And I think it is important to start with his dad.
Yeah.
It says Jephthah's father had relations with a prostitute.
Right.
You don't hear that happened before he was married. It could have been in the context of marriage. So this could be either adultery or at the very least just promiscuity, which is bad enough.
Right.
That's what starts this whole ball rolling. And what we kind of found was there's a series of vows throughout this. His father breaks his wedding vow,
right,
or his vow to God is living as a chaste vow. Then the people of the town, after they kick Jephthah out, to try and get him to fight for them, they make just a hasty vow. Not just, hey, come and fight for us and you can be the general, or
right,
we'll reward you, but we'll make you king, basically.
Yeah, anyone who will come be our leader will be over us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Win the battle and you can rule over us. And there's just no reason for this here. You want a ruler to have wisdom and be well-versed in, the politicals, but they're just recklessly going to make him head of the nation if he wins this war for them.
Right.
And then Jephthah turns around and makes, there's just no other way to say it, the stupidest vow that I can remember in the Old Testament.
Right.
Which is, as you said, dear God, if you will grant me victory, I need you to prove it, but if you will, the first thing that greets me when I get home, I'll sacrifice.
And in the Old Testament, vows were meant to be kept. And there's scriptures that say it's better not to make a vow than it is to make a vow and not keep it. So the one question that I have is, why did he make the vow?
Yeah.
Second,
there's no reason. God has given him the victory already.
The verses right before that say the Spirit of the Lord was upon him. And it seems like there's still this underlying fear that he wants to make doubly sure that God's going to come through.
Yeah.
And so, hey, God, if you do this for me, I'm going to really show you how faithful I am. Whatever greets me. Another question that I have with Jephthah is, why the lack of specificity? If he thought it was going to be one of the animals, say that you'll sacrifice the firstborn animal, the first fruits
the best
of your
cow
crop.
In your pen.
Yeah,
exactly.
The best of the best. But it's almost like he's like saying that, like, oh, look at the seriousness of my offering. But the ambiguousness of it leaves it totally open.
Yeah.
And it's
just crazy.
Yeah. The thing that I don't know about you, but generally, when you're thinking about who's going to come greet you after you've been gone in war, battle, I'm not thinking a camel.
No.
I'm not thinking some
or the house
animal.
cat that I can't stand. Yeah.
Yeah. But likely, maybe your daughter, your only daughter who's missed you deeply.
Yeah. Or your wife. You start running through it, it's like, his wife could have come out.
Yeah.
But his daughter comes out.
His wife's probably the second option.
Yeah.
For who could have visited him. Or the first,
or his most trusted servant. Just the recklessness of this vow is just insane.
Right.
So he makes his vow, she comes out. And then here's another question, and I'm sorry we're so void of answers. But here's another question I have. Well, what happens if he doesn't keep the vow? So in the scenario, if he realizes, oh my gosh, I've just put my daughter on the chopping block, break the vow and take the consequences. You would think as a father, you're going to take a father or husband, you're going to take the hit. But he's going to, maybe he dies.
Right.
That's probably, that's fitting, but he goes through with it. That's a mind blower.
And yeah, we're just left with more questions than answers. Why, Jephthah? Why?
When even the vow itself, we looked this up today. This is a verse, or actually yesterday, Deuteronomy 12. And this also speaks to how goofy the vow is.
Yeah.
So Deuteronomy 12, 29 through 31. I don't have my glasses on, so I'm going to lean forward. Oh, there we go. Look at that. The Lord your God will cut off before you the nations you are about to invade. That sounds like Jephthah. And dispossess. But when you have driven them out and settled in their land, and after they have been destroyed before you, be careful not to be ensnared by inquiring about their gods, saying, how do these nations serve their gods? We will do the same, which is the story of Judges. And by the way, which is this vow, because as you're going to see, the vow he makes, it's a pagan vow. You must not worship the Lord your God in their way, which is what he's doing, because in worshiping their gods, they do all kinds of detestable things the Lord hates. They even burn their sons and daughters in the fire as sacrifices to their gods.
And so really what we see is, and I think maybe this speaks to the pervasiveness of the idolatry. You know, earlier in the narrative of Jephthah, we see the sevenfold progression of idolatry of the people. Jephthah here, as you read, is responding more based upon how these pagan gods would want versus the Lord his God commands you should not sacrifice
Right.
human sacrifice. That's a response of the pagans, not one of someone who follows God.
Yeah. It's a mind blower. The whole thing is so to the question asker, the listener who asked the question, Jonathan Ewart, it really is, you really are seeing it speaks to the downward spiral. You're seeing this just generational decay within the nation.
Yeah.
And here it plays out, then there's just this generational decay of sin, even within one of the judges. It's funny, someone said to me 2 weeks ago, I don't know how the stories can get any worse. But you just see the darkness of sin, the wages of sin, as you said, the just the pervasiveness.
And it's
sin.
interesting because it almost seems like they've spiraled to such a place that they're no longer
Right.
like Jephthah is not viewing the world through a lens of what it is to be a follower of God.
Right.
That his lens, his total worldview is more like the surrounding culture than it is one of God's people.
Yeah.
And I think it just speaks to the how far they have fallen.
Right. Yeah, and I think, we see it too in our life and times. But, this idea of forgetting the Lord generation after generation after generation, you're exactly right. There's not even any orientation other than I'm saying a prayer, I'm making a vow, which is very Judaic. But there's just, it's like he's in the dark, just stumbling around. And especially in the last three judges. But next week,
Yeah.
we see Jephthah's story on steroids. It's like you think surely we hit rock bottom this time. And it's just, it just keeps going. The rabbit hole just goes deeper again.
And how about Jephthah's daughter in this? That when she greets him with dancing and excitement, and he says to her, "You have brought me down."
Oh my gosh.
And it's just shocking to me. It's like, no, you did this,
Yeah.
Jephthah. But then his daughter's response of, "My father, do as you have vowed to the Lord." Just this place of surrender, this place of, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, she really stands out in the chapter as the only godly character you can find. Just there is a fear of the Lord. And even in her response, there's a trust there. Like, God is to be feared. God is to be obeyed. But you kind of feel from her, there's this, I'm going to mourn my life. I'm never going to be a mother, a wife.
Yeah.
But there's this sense of surrendered resignation and trust, like the Lord will receive me. You just feel that in her words because it's, she just won't hear of anything other than you pledge this before God and we need to walk this out.
And it just reminds me of Jesus in the garden as he's praying to his Father, "Not my will, but yours be done." And we see his sacrifice ultimately that brings us into freedom.
And by the way, that reminds me, in saying that about Christ, there is a Where's Waldo throughout the book of Judges. In every story, there is someone who, even if it's briefly, but there's someone who strongly mirrors Christ. There's a character, or maybe a combination of characters in a sense, in a couple of stories. But Jesus appears even kind of symbolically through, and I believe she she's the one in this chapter. You got it right.
And one of the things that I think is interesting with the story of Jephthah is he was kicked out of his family. He was kind of banished out. And one of the things that thinking of, all right, a lot of times what happens when Jephthah's family does this to him, I bet internally he's thinking, the last thing I want to do is do that. I want to be different than what happened to me.
Right.
I feel like that's a lot of times a response that we might feel internally of, I don't want to do what was done to me. But then what do we see at the end? That Jephthah, through all the circumstances of what we've outlined, he banishes his daughter to the hills to mourn before he ultimately kills her.
Right.
And it's just this reality of wounded people wound people.
Right.
And I mean, we see this here, and we see it in our lives, and we see it all over. Do you have any thoughts on?
No, I absolutely. I thought that was one of the strongest points of the message, but it's that call to us that we're not going to willpower our way out of the swamp, out of our sin. We're not going to fix it. Our best intentions fall flat. We've got to be healed by God. And that's what's so tragic about the story is Jephthah has an opportunity. When he's received as this warrior king, he's got an opportunity to live a different life in relationship with God. And he's kind of like our next hero, Samson. And I won't try to give anything away there, but there's the absolute potential for a better outcome. I mean, not only will you kind of be a bust in the Hall of Fame, but your life and your legacy. But his family line ends. I mean, that's the tragedy.
Right.
With the death of his daughter, that's the end of his family line. He has no other children. And it's a tragic, tragic end that doesn't have to be, because, the one who created our hearts wants to heal them in relationship with him.
And one of a comment that got brought up in one of the discussion groups is, we've all been rejected in different ways, but what do we do with our rejection? And just thinking about that, like when we are rejected, do we try to prove that person wrong? Right. To your point, overcome it through our own willpower.
Yeah.
Do we kind of resign to it? Do we just accept it? Do we just, oh, well, I guess this is just me.
Yeah.
Or do we maybe try to seek validation through other things? Or do we look to Jesus as also one who was rejected? And, we look to him and we find our identity in him. And that, to your point, creates a purpose and an identity that's deeper. Because when you're rejected, it can affect your identity. But, I love that question of where do we go when we've been rejected?
Yeah, I have a good friend in ministry. He was one of my first mentors, and he would say, we all get hurt, betrayed. Maybe it's self-inflicted. It could be family abuse, whatever, but it happens to all of us. And we have two choices. We get bitter or better. And all those other things we might do, revenge, which is next week's story, my goodness. Whether it's revenge or validation or proving our case, all those are versions of getting bitter. And through Christ, we get better. And it just, Jane and I were talking yesterday, about having a vision for our lives. And this is something that we've kind of fallen into this conversation in part because of the Judges series. But it's, I want to have a vision of who I can become. What's possible? What does my heart long for? And we were listing all these things off like, I want to be a 88-year-old man, just full of joy that people want to seek out. I still hold hands with my wife. You know, we laugh, we converse. And Jane, she articulated hers, but there were just these visions of health and joy and the fruit of the Spirit. And immediately we turned to one another and went, we got a lot of work to do. You know,
Right.
Jesus needs to keep working. And I think a lot of times as Christians, we get to this point where we're like, you know what? I got Christ. I'm a good church attender, and I'm going to float from here out.
Right.
And it's a real fallacy of the Christian life. You know, we need disciplines. We need to keep going. As long as we're down here, we are pilgrims on a journey with Jesus, and we don't want to settle way before the finish line.
Right. I love the question, and I often ask this of myself. Over time, is my heart becoming harder or softer?
So good.
And, you know, each year, even this year, is my heart becoming softer,
Yeah.
more in tune with the Lord, more just love for people, just displaying the fruit of the Spirit, just my life? Or is my heart becoming harder? Is bitterness taking over more and more? And I think a big part of that is, since we've all been wounded, what is our response when we have?
Yeah.
Over time, it's really easy when you've been hurt for your heart to harden over time. But it's the question of, all right, each year, is my heart becoming softer or harder? That amplified over a decade,
Right.
over a lifetime. At 30 years from now, if my heart's getting softer every year, to your point,
Yeah.
that 88-year-old, right? That's, it's a beautiful thing. If my heart's becoming harder every year, 30 years down the road, I look back and like, oh, what have I become?
What a wasted life. I'm more afraid. I'm angrier. You know, I'm more neurotic, have to be in control, or I've let go. The headlines don't matter. Because at the end, you always see the same thing. People always say the same thing. Nothing else matters but who I love and who loved me. Who I became, who I affected. You know, it's all that matters in the end.
And you know what we can't say through this book of Judges, through our study? We can't say that it's not applicable to our lives.
Amen.
Do you have any previews for the final week
Yeah.
in our Judges series?
Folks, if you have not read the story of Samson, Judges 13 through 17, 18, I'm studying this right now, 16. Anyway,
I think 16.
16. So it's 4 chapters, 13 through 16. You've got to read it again. It is astounding. It will bring up tons of questions. Fortunately, in the case of Samson, we have so much scholarship, so there are a lot of nuances. There are a lot of questions that'll come up. It is a page turner, and though it ends in a very kind of dark place, on one hand, it just opens the door to the tremendous light and life of God. Really sets our Lord and Savior, the King of Kings, Jesus, up beautifully. So come out. We're going to have a lot of fun with Samson. Probably shed a tear or two over the tragicness, but it is
Wow.
we're going to have a good time with it.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Look forward to it. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you on Sunday.